Welcome back to Cornish Talks Common Sense. Today we have a fresh and timely topic to speak to you about. We're going to talk about the conflict that's been unfolding in Israel, with Israel and Hamas, and we'll be right back in 1 minute to talk about that. Welcome back. So, as I've just suggested to you, we're going to talk today about the conflict in Israel between the Israelis and the Hamas terrorist organization. So, the first question we need to ask is, why is a country like Israel, one of the smaller countries of the world, attracting the global media attention that has been unfolding in the recent weeks? This question is puzzling, to say the least, but I'm going to try to add some explanation to that today. So let's take a look and dig into this. Israel is a country of very small population. I have with me today the Economist Pocket Book of World Figures, and so it tells us that the country of Israel has less than 9 million citizens. And it's a country of only 22,000 square miles. Very small by the standards of any country in the world today. So why does it attract so much attention in the world in 2023? Well, what we find out is that the Israeli and Palestinian and Arab conflict is not new, and it's not something that is even just a few decades old. It goes back through history thousands of years, and the conflict and wars that have occurred in that region of the globe have existed over that thousands of years of time on a fairly continuous basis. So let's explore and consider just exactly what is happening there. Now, before I go into the particulars of that situation, I want to just take a step back to the themes that I've developed in some of the earlier programming that we've done on this show, because I think it provides some important background and themes that help us to understand why things are the way they are in the world today. So you might recall that the first of those that I spoke about is something I've called the advent of postmodernism. So what is that? The advent of postmodernism simply says that we now live in a post-truth world where objective truth is no longer recognized. Instead, everybody has their own subjective truth, truth values that are just whatever is right for them. And there's no singular objective truth. And we know that that's developed from theorists, philosophers such as Jacques Derrida, is one of the primaries who instilled the growth of this postmodernism movement that has captured all of our society and civilization today. So that's one thing that's important to understand is that we live in a post-truth world, a world where truth is just simply viewed as a subjective commodity. The second item I want to touch on is the abandonment of eschatology. Now, you might recall that I talked about that as being the idea that eschatology is the idea that God has a plan for mankind. In other words, firstly, the premise that God actually exists. Today, by and large, God is simply dismissed either as irrelevant or non-existent. And so if we dispose of God in that manner, then we are all that exists, and mankind is all there is. And so we have to look after ourselves, and that is why, for example, there's been such a huge concern over issues like climate change in recent years, because mankind considers that if we don't save ourselves, then we're doomed. And so that's a logical notion that follows from the idea of there being no God, no created world. And so therefore, because mankind has just evolved and we're on our own, we have to look after things ourselves, our own way, and we don't care about the notion of God. We don't care about the notion that God describes a plan that he lays out for mankind in the Bible. And so if we don't understand these underlying premises, then it becomes very hard to understand what is happening in the modern world today. And particularly that is the case with the Israeli and Hamas conflict. And I'm going to try to demonstrate why that is the case. So what's important to understand is we have to look all the way back to the beginning of the Bible, the Old Testament of the Bible, and as far back as Genesis, to understand why the Israeli and Arab conflict was generated. So the starting point I want to just mention just very briefly on this point is that if we go all the way back to Genesis 12, we find a promise that God makes to Abraham that he's going to create a nation for himself, his chosen people, and that location was going to be where present-day Israel is. And so there was a promise of the creation of the nation of Israel. And then we find, though, that the Israeli people the Israelites were disobedient to God and pursued their own pathway. So then God said, "Okay, I'm going to not prepare this land for you yet." And you find, for example, an interesting passage at the beginning of Deuteronomy where it talks about there are 11 days' journey to where the Israelites left Egypt with the Exodus and passed through the lands in what is now the Egyptian and Gaza area. And it talks about that it's 11 days journey to get from Egypt to where they needed to go. And then in the very next verse it talks about, and 40 years later, 40 years the Jews were stuck in the wilderness because they disobeyed God. And so they didn't get the promise of the nationhood in that region right away. And so God then eventually, after going through the different kingdoms that are described in Kings and Chronicles in the Bible, then you find that the Jews are dispersed. And we know as a historical fact that happened. The Jews were dispersed to all corners of the globe and had no nation. And so that's described in the Bible as well. And I have a few verses I can point to from my own book that I've talked to you about before, Now Through a Glass Darkly, where I examined some of these very important and somewhat difficult topics sometimes. And so, for example, when I talk about the dispersal of the Jews, I quoted from Deuteronomy 4:27, which says, "And the Lord shall scatter you among the nations, and you shall be left few in number among the heathen, whither the Lord shall lead you." And then in Leviticus 26, it talks about, "I will scatter you among the heathen. I will draw out a sword after you, and your land shall be desolate, and your cities waste. And yet after all that, when they be in the land of their enemies, I will not cast them away, neither will I abhor them to destroy them utterly and to break my covenant with them, for I am the Lord their God." So God dispersed the Jews because they were disobedient, and so they went to all corners of the earth. But then something very profound has happened only in the recent decades. And that was when the Jewish people were regathered in what now is the current Israel. And that happened in 1948. In May of 1948, May 14th, I believe, of 1948, where Israel was reconstituted after thousands of years as a nation. And one has to question, how in the world could something like that have happened? This very small country of a very small number of people that were brought back to be reconstituted in a nation after thousands of years. That is an unparalleled story in the history of mankind. That has not happened in any other case of any other ethnic group or people. So that in itself speaks volumes as to the plan that God described in the Bible as to what would happen, because it's unparalleled by any other circumstance or ethnic group in the history of mankind. And the probability of it happening is just so profoundly small. So I want to give you a little history lesson of what happened. So in doing so, I'm going to spend some time referring to a book by Martin Gilbert called The Atlas of the Arab-Israeli Conflict. And this is one of the best volumes to describe the history I've been talking to you about. And he does it with maps that goes through the whole history, right from the time before Christ, right up to largely the present moment. And so I'm going to just hit on a few historical points that I think are important to know, because what gets lost in our examination of this topic today is the factual history. Because remember I said, people don't pay attention to facts anymore. Truth is subjective. Everybody has their own truth. And now people govern their thoughts by their feelings, how they feel. And so that's why we see so many protests. Just in this last week's protests at numerous universities, in the United States especially, but around the world, where Palestinians and Hamas supporters are protesting, sometimes with violence, in universities and other locations around North America. So why is this happening? Is it based on fact? Is it based on truth? Or is it based on people's feelings, based on misperceptions and wrong thinking about what in fact is the history of this matter? So I want to talk to you a little bit about that from a factual backdrop. So it's important to understand the following facts, and Martin Gilbert describes a lot of this in his book. So what's important to understand is that in and around the time of World War I, the lands in the Middle East area, and particularly the lands that are now Israel, were controlled by the Turkish Empire. And so the Turks controlled that, but they were defeated and displaced by largely the British. And so what occurred then is the British, and to some degree the French, repatriated that area of the Middle East that encompasses Israel and some of the surrounding area. One of its neighbors at that point was called Transjordan, what is now modern Jordan. And France had control over largely that area. And Britain had control largely over what is now Israel. So that takes us as far back as 1915. And then in 1917, something unfolded called the Balfour Declaration. And the Balfour Declaration was a British mandate that sought to create an Israeli state, to recreate the nation of Israel. And there also was discussion about creating two states, which would include Palestinians and Israel. But it's important to know that the Arabs and Palestinians rejected that. They rejected that plan. So with the assistance of Britain, there was a movement toward creating the Israelite nation as far back as 1917. But what you see from Martin Gilbert's book is that he goes through the terrorism and war and conflict that happened throughout that period, and he deals with it virtually year by year, and looking at Arab campaigns to prevent the nation of Israel from becoming a reality. And so terroristic attacks, he goes through the years, 1936 and 1938 and onward, detailing what is primarily terrorism by the Arab countries and by Arabs against Jewish settlers in that region. And so it's documented very extensively and very thoroughly that throughout that period of decades, from 1917 forward and through the 1940s, the Jewish settlers who had been repatriated to that land, bought property, lived there, and yet were terrorized and often many killed throughout that whole time frame. So that was a constant unfolding. And we have something in 1937 called the Peel Commission, which was another effort to study and recommending the Jewish state be created, also exploring how that would be done and whether it would involve a nation for Palestine or not. But again, the Palestinians rejected that. And so then in 1948, and really with the backing of the United Nations, Israel in May of 1948 then is created as its own nation, its own country with boundaries that were mapped out. But what we find is that was, again, immediately rejected by the Arab neighbors. And so, again, constant terrorism and attacks followed from the creation of the nation, even literally the day after. It was created as a country in May of 1948. In May 15th, Arabs invaded and were repelled. And then we know that since then there have been other wars. The Six-Day War in 1967 and the Yom Kippur War in 1973, in which the Israelis were successful in both and actually expanded their territory in repelling Arab attacks. So nothing illegitimate there. So this has been a constant conflictual and circumstance of war and terrorism that has gone on over all of the history effectively of mankind and really in the 1900s since 1915 and carrying on through 1948 and up to the present time through the 60s and 70s and up to the present moment. So I want to emphasize to you how, again, profoundly improbable and unusual this event of the creation of Israel is. And apart from recognizing eschatology and God's involvement in human history, I would say it would be unbelievable for anybody to understand what is happening now. And let me try to make that point even a little bit more convincingly to you. So I have some data with me today that I wanted to spend some time on. So again, I referred already to the Economist Pocketbook of World Figures, which is just a handy way to look at some of this information. So I've told you that Israel is a small country of less than 9 million people. Well, let's compare that to the Arab neighbors, because if we look at the country of Israel, it's easy to recognize that it is surrounded entirely by Arab countries. So their adversaries, their enemies surround this small territory. And so we see on a map, we see the country of Egypt to the southwest boundary of Israel. And we see the country of Jordan to the east. And not far away is Saudi Arabia. And then to the north of Israel is Syria and also Lebanon. So Israel is surrounded by all of these Arab countries. Let's compare some of the data, because this is a fascinating study in which to engage. So let's just look at the data that pertains to some of the Arab countries. So Israel has 22,000 square miles. Egypt alone is 1 million square miles. The population of Egypt is almost 98 million people. And then Iran, which is not abutting along the border of Israel, but again is a very close country. And as we know, Iran is a country that is behind a lot of the terrorism with Hezbollah and Hamas. And so Iran is probably the predominant enemy of Israel that is invoking a lot of the violence and terrorism that has unfolded. So the country of Iran is 1.6 million square miles and a nation of 81 million people. And I've got some data that I wrote down on Lebanon as well. Lebanon is a country of 6 million. It's a little bit smaller. Jordan has 11 million people. Syria, 21 million. Saudi Arabia, 36 million. Iraq, 43 million. So I did a tally of all this information. And so what we find is that the country of Israel, of 9 million people, is opposed by its Arab neighboring countries of over 314 million people. So you've got a nation of 9 million people who has fought against 314 million. Now, how would anyone imagine any military general or any person astute in military theory, how would it be understood that a nation of 9 million people could withstand against the forces of Arab neighbors numbering 314 million? And again, if we compare the land masses in play, I didn't do the grand total on that. It's a large number. Again, we have the 22,000 square miles of Israel. And even just from the numbers I've mentioned to you for Egypt and Iran, they're each over 1 million square miles, let alone some of the other countries in that vicinity as well, Jordan, Syria, and Lebanon, and Iraq. The total would be tens of millions of acres under Arab control versus 22,000 square miles for Israel. So obviously a huge imbalance. And yet we see that the Arab nations, and particularly some of their terrorist-sponsored groups, reject the existence of Israel altogether, notwithstanding this disparity of populations and the disparity of land mass that's controlled by the Arab countries already. So let's come back in just one moment, and we're going to talk a little bit more about what's unfolding now at this present moment with the Israeli-Hamas conflict. Welcome back. Let me just step back just for one moment again. There's a lot of political theory that has gone on in the recent past that talks about mankind progressing to sort of an end state of perhaps not perfection, but some sort of utopian existence. Some of you might recall a book by an author, Francis Fukuyama, who wrote a book that talked about the whole notion of mankind reaching the final state of kind of liberal democracy dominating the world. But what we see is he's wrong, and that has not been the pattern of how history has developed. And in fact, we're seeing war and conflict unfolding, and one of the most important of which we're talking about now with the country of Israel and the Hamas terrorist group in particular. So this is, again, an age-old argument that's been discussed. I have with me today also the book, The Clash of Civilizations, Remaking of World Order by Samuel Huntington, a well-known book that talks about, again, this conflict that's unfolded between the West and the East, or the Western world and Israel, and then the Arab world. Another one I have with me, one of Bernard Lewis's book called What Went Wrong. He's written a number of books talking about the clash between Islam and modernity in the Middle East. And another author who's well known on this subject is Daniel Pipes. I have one of his books with me today, Militant, Islam Reaches America, which we know it did with the 9/11 incident in the United States, and so there's a number of authors who have talked about this topic. But I want to focus in right now on what has been happening just in the last weeks. So I've described this small country of Israel, 22,000 square miles, less than 9 million people, surrounded by massive adversarial countries of millions of miles in size and hundreds of millions of people. Something that one could not believe how the nation of Israel could survive in this circumstance. So I want to tell you a little bit about why this present situation is unfolding. So what you need to know then is, after all the conflict I've just described to you over all of the thousands of years now, we find that Palestine had obtained some occupation, if you will, of land in the Gaza Strip area, and Hamas was elected by the Palestinians to govern that area. So the Palestinians elected this terrorist group who sort of displaced Fatah and the PLO, and they chose volitionally Hamas to govern them. And what we find out, though, is as soon as Hamas took control, they then did displace its rivals, and they have held no elections since 2006. So Hamas has governed not democratically and in a manner that has generated conflict and terrorism with Israel. And so I want to talk then about what is the charter, the covenant of Hamas that indicates what their goals are and what their platform is, if you will, that outlines what the purpose is for their existence. And so I have a copy of that with me today, the Hamas Covenant, which was created and issued on August 18th of 1988 by the Islamic Resistance Movement, also known as Hamas, which can only be characterized as an extremist, fundamentalist Islamic organization operating in territories that are under the control of Israel, and so that would include the Gaza Strip. So, Covenant of Hamas, it states in its preamble the goal of the total destruction of Israel. And I'll quote to you one section. It says, Israel will exist and will continue to exist until Islam will obliterate it, just as it obliterated others before it. And it goes on to talk about the exclusiveness of their designs on the country of Israel. Article 13, Palestine is an Islamic land. Since this is the case, the liberation of Palestine is an individual duty for every Muslim, wherever he may be. And then in Article 15, it goes on to what they characterize as the call to jihad, which of course is the Muslim concept of a war of purification. And it says this: the day the enemies usurp part of Muslim land, jihad becomes the individual duty of every Muslim. In the face of the Jews' usurpation, it's compulsory that the banner of jihad be raised. And they talk about the ranks will close and fighters will gather to fight against Israel. So this is in the founding document of Hamas, its reason for existence. And so right from the outset, it pronounces its intent to destroy the country of Israel, to obliterate it from the face of the world. And so again, one has to question, why have they not succeeded against this small country of Israel? And again, I've said to you, we can only understand this reality in the context of eschatology and biblical prophecy and precepts that are described there. But what we find out since the attack on October 7th of Hamas unleashed in the Gaza Strip, we find the horror and depravity and malevolence of the Hamas terrorist organization. So we learn things like Hamas has created a tunnel system and has done so underneath hospitals and vulnerable places, thinking that they will be safe from attack. And so a very really what can only be described as a depraved strategy to have arms, munitions buried or stored underneath hospitals where people are cared for. But yet that's been their strategy. And then we've heard about the difficulty after the horrendous attack of October 7th. Now there's been a concern raised of getting aid to Palestinians who were advised to journey south to a safer area by the Israelis. And yet Hamas has told people to stay and to be in the line of fire, if you will. And we find that efforts to get food aid into the Gaza Strip has actually been stolen by Hamas. They've actually stolen food from the trucks that have been sent by United Nations and other organizations to try to help Palestinians. And Hamas has stopped that from happening. And not only that, but then we find that they have engaged in propaganda, blaming the Israelis for the missile strike that occurred very close to the hospital at El-Hi Hospital in the Gaza Strip, blaming the Israelis for that attack and getting most of the world media, by the way, most of the liberal media of the world immediately grabbed a hold of that notion that Israel was responsible. But then we find out with some concerted investigation, which thankfully happened fairly quickly, that in fact we find out that it was the other Islamic Jihad organization that fired that missile in a cemetery very close to the proximity of the hospital, and it went astray and blew up in the parking lot of the hospital, killing people there. So Hamas is an organization that has no fidelity to the truth, that has a tendency and a proclivity to deception and lies and malevolent behavior that includes not only terroristic acts of horror, but stopping food from going into their own people, Palestinians, and engaging in other subterfuge and lies that have to be called out and need to be called out by the media in all parts of the world, but sadly has not been called out very strongly to this extent. We even know that the country of Egypt, to which Palestinians could take refuge, all the Arab neighbors that surround Israel that could take Palestinians into refuge, instead they're blocked from doing that by their own peoples. And so, for example, it was Egypt that closed the Rafah Gate, one of the primary crossing entrances from Egypt into Palestine, and they blocked people from leaving Gaza to enter into Egypt, and they blocked food from getting into Gaza from Egypt. So these are the Arabs' own acts which have profoundly caused a large measure of the horror and difficult circumstances that now exist in that region of the world. So this is not an issue of moral equivalence. This is an issue of terrorists seeking to annihilate a country that is simply only defending itself, having been created lawfully, as I've outlined to you through history. This is not a case of Israeli occupation. We need to know and understand the history that has occurred for thousands of years, coming to fruition in 1948, and now engaging the world in a conflict that is gathering attention from all quarters of the earth. And there's a reason for that, and that's because God describes this very path, this very pattern of events in His Word, the Bible. And if we don't understand that, we are condemned to not understand this conflict and how it will be resolved going forward. So thank you for listening to what is a very demanding and difficult topic. I hope it's been of interest to you. Thank you for listening.